What happens when a nation the world underestimated suddenly decides it will no longer play by the rules written in Washington? What happens when that nation, once seen as a follower, turns into a force rewriting the very script of global power? The answer is India. And with one decisive move, it has left the United States shocked, scrambling, and forced to recognize a new reality. India's strategic autonomy has emerged as one of the most defining aspects of its rise on the global stage, and it is this posture that recently shocked the United States in a way few would have anticipated. For decades, Washington has been accustomed to dictating terms to nations it considers partners or allies, expecting alignment with its policies, whether in defense, trade, or foreign relations. Yet India's recent move made it abundantly clear that it does not see itself as a follower but as an independent force that will not compromise its sovereignty for short-term favors. What caught the US off guard was the way India asserted itself without hesitation, rejecting the idea of being boxed into a camp and instead carving out a role that prioritizes national interest above external pressure. The Americans had banked on India being a loyal partner in their broader Indo-Pacific strategy, but New Delhi's message was unambiguous. Partnership does not mean servitude. India's tradition of non-alignment has always hovered in its diplomatic DNA, but now it has been transformed into something far more powerful. Strategic autonomy backed by economic weight, military modernization, and global influence. When Washington attempted to pressure India on its defense cooperation with Russia or its oil purchases, expecting compliance, India flipped the script. It reminded the US that while cooperation is welcome, coercion will not be tolerated. By maintaining relations with Russia, engaging in BRICS, and still holding firm ties with the Quad, India demonstrated that it is perfectly capable of walking multiple paths simultaneously. This was not just a geopolitical calculation, it was a declaration that India will not outsource its foreign policy. The move sent ripples across Washington because it undermined the assumption that India could be cornered into choosing sides. By showcasing strategic autonomy, India positioned itself as a power that others must negotiate with, not dictate to. For the US, used to allies bending under pressure, the shock lay in realizing that India would not bend, and instead it would thrive by playing its cards with precision and independence. The message was unmistakable. India is no longer a nation seeking validation from the West, but one that demands respect on its own terms. India's decision to diversify its defense and trade ties in recent years is one of the clearest demonstrations of its refusal to be dependent on any single power, and this has unsettled Washington more than most observers realize. For decades, the US has seen arms sales as a tool not only for military cooperation, but also for strategic leverage, expecting countries that rely on American weaponry to fall in line with its foreign policy preferences. India disrupted this calculation with one bold move. Instead of surrendering to American dominance in defense procurement, it sought equipment and technology from multiple sources, balancing the US with Russia, France, Israel, and indigenous projects. The Americans expected that after the signing of foundational defense agreements and joint exercises, India would tilt completely toward US hardware. But India's purchase of systems like the Russian S-400 and French Rafale fighters sent a shock through Washington. The message was clear. India will not put its national security hostage to the whims of one supplier, particularly one with a history of imposing sanctions or restrictions when political winds change. What magnified the shock was India's timing. As Washington was attempting to tighten its grip on the global defense market, India was expanding partnerships across the board, making it clear that no one nation, however powerful, would be allowed to monopolize its military modernization. On the trade side, the same pattern emerged. Rather than aligning completely with US expectations on sanctions or trade restrictions, India deliberately widened its network of partners, deepening ties with Europe, strengthening bonds with Russia, and accelerating economic engagement with Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The United States suddenly found itself in a position it did not anticipate, needing India as a counterweight to China, but unable to fully control India's choices. This inversion of dependency is what stunned Washington most. India's diversification policy also reflects long-term strategic thinking. By not putting all eggs in the US basket, India shields itself from the vulnerabilities that have trapped other nations. It gains leverage in negotiations, ensures continuous supply chains for critical equipment, and secures the freedom to pursue independent foreign policies. For the US, this move was not just surprising, it was a wake-up call that India is determined to build an arsenal and economy on its own terms, immune to external pressure and impossible to coerce. India's decision to continue importing discounted Russian oil in the face of mounting Western pressure was one of the most decisive moves that shocked Washington. For the United States, which had launched a global campaign to isolate Moscow after the Ukraine conflict, the expectation was that major democracies like India would fall in line, cutting off energy ties and aligning with sanctions. Yet India took a stand that was both pragmatic and bold, prioritizing the needs of its economy and its people over American geopolitical expectations. Energy is the lifeblood of growth, and for a nation of more than 1 billion people striving to rise as an economic superpower, securing affordable and reliable oil supplies was non-negotiable. By choosing to purchase Russian crude despite threats of criticism or diplomatic pushback, India sent a clear signal. It will not allow external powers to dictate its economic policy, especially when its national development is at stake. What unsettled Washington even more was how unapologetically India defended this choice. Indian officials repeatedly emphasized that their moral responsibility was to their citizens, not to the strategic ambitions of foreign capitals. While Europe itself continued to import significant volumes of Russian energy under the radar, the US attempted to paint India's actions as defiance. Instead of retreating, India doubled down, ramping up imports and using its refining capacity to not only meet domestic demand, but also to re-export fuels globally. This demonstrated not just independence, but ingenuity, turning a pressure point into a strategic advantage. The shock to the US also stemmed from the broader implications of this move. By openly defying Western sanctions and maintaining energy ties with Russia, India revealed cracks in the so-called united front against Moscow. It showed that the West no longer holds a monopoly on shaping global energy flows, and that large nations with growing economies will chart their own course when survival and growth are on the line. For Washington, this was not merely about oil, it was about losing leverage. Energy has long been a tool of geopolitical influence, and India's refusal to play by American rules meant the US had less ability to bend global markets to its will. India's stand on oil was therefore a masterstroke of strategic independence. It stabilized its economy during a time of global turmoil, secured affordable energy for its citizens, and reminded the world that it would never sacrifice sovereignty at the altar of foreign expectations. The US was left stunned, realizing that India was not a junior partner, but an autonomous power capable of shaping its own destiny, even in the face of immense international pressure. India's willingness to challenge the dominance of the US dollar in international trade is one of the most profound moves that sent shockwaves through Washington. For decades, America's greatest strength has not only been its military might, but the grip it holds over the global financial system. The dollar has functioned as the backbone of world trade, giving the US unparalleled influence in imposing sanctions, controlling banking flows, and exercising power without deploying a single soldier. When India began exploring and implementing alternative arrangements, whether through rupee-ruble trade with Russia, local currency agreements with nations in the Middle East, or support for initiatives within BRICS to reduce reliance on the dollar. It signaled a direct challenge to this financial monopoly. For Washington, the realization was startling. Here was a nation that had both the economic clout and political will to poke holes in the system America had carefully built and relied upon for decades. What made India's move even more shocking was that it came at a time when the US was doubling down on weaponizing the dollar through sanctions against adversaries. India's approach undermined the very mechanism Washington depended on to maintain its dominance. By creating channels to pay for oil and other commodities in local currencies, India not only cushioned itself from external shocks, but also created a model that other countries could replicate. This wasn't just a one-off defiance of American pressure. It was the beginning of a structural shift in the way nations conducted business, reducing exposure to dollar volatility and US financial coercion. The US also underestimated the ripple effects of India's boldness. Once India, a country of over 1 billion people with one of the fastest-growing economies, took the initiative, smaller nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America found encouragement to do the same. India's push for financial independence dovetailed with its positioning as a leader of the global South, making it more than a national move. It became a rallying cry for dozens of countries tired of being trapped under dollar dependency. Washington suddenly found itself facing the uncomfortable truth that its financial dominance, once unquestioned, was no longer guaranteed. For India, this strategy wasn't about provoking America, but about securing long-term stability. By reducing reliance on the dollar, India could protect itself from sudden sanctions, ensure smoother trade with diverse partners, and strengthen its sovereignty in economic decision-making. For the US, however, it was a rude awakening that India was not only challenging its geopolitical dominance, but also striking at the financial foundation that underpins American power worldwide. It was a shock, not because it was loud or theatrical, but because it was quiet, deliberate, and potentially irreversible. India's ability to balance its geopolitical relationships between rival powers has become one of the most striking demonstrations of its rising influence, and this is precisely what stunned Washington. For years, the US foreign policy establishment has thrived on a binary worldview where nations are either allies or adversaries, firmly placed in one camp. But India disrupted this narrative entirely by proving it could maintain close ties with America through platforms like the Quad, while simultaneously strengthening its presence in BRICS alongside Russia and China. This dual engagement was not seen as possible by many in Washington, who believed India would eventually be forced to choose sides. Instead, India made it clear that it refuses to be boxed into a corner and that its national interests dictate its alignments, not external pressure. What shocked the US was not merely the balancing act itself, but the confidence with which India executed it. On one hand, India deepened military cooperation with the US, conducting joint exercises and sharing intelligence in the Indo-Pacific to counterbalance China's rise. On the other hand, it openly continued defense purchases from Russia and maintained diplomatic dialogue with Beijing through regional platforms. This ability to compartmentalize relations, to work with adversaries of one partner while cooperating closely with the same partner, revealed a level of strategic sophistication that Washington had not fully anticipated. For a long time, the US believed India would inevitably lean toward the West as China's threat grew larger, but India's refusal to abandon its multi-aligned approach sent a clear message. It will not allow itself to become a pawn in another superpower rivalry. This balancing strategy also reflects India's understanding of its unique position in the global order. Unlike many countries pressured into alignment, India has both the size and the leverage to engage with all sides on its own terms. By keeping doors open with both blocs, India maximizes benefits in trade, technology, defense, and diplomacy while minimizing risks. The shock for Washington lay in the realization that India could simultaneously be a partner and an independent pole of power, one that cannot be taken for granted or controlled through typical carrot-and-stick approaches. The balancing act has also elevated India's prestige globally. Nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America see India as a model for resisting the trap of great power rivalry, while still benefiting from all sides. For the US, this represented a major recalibration. Instead of treating India as a subordinate ally, it had to confront the fact that India was now a sovereign power navigating global currents with far more independence and authority than Washington expected. That recognition, abrupt and undeniable, was the true shock. India's emergence as a powerful voice of the global South has been one of the most defining developments in international politics, and it is this shift that shook Washington's confidence in its ability to dominate global narratives. For decades, the United States positioned itself as the guardian of democracy and the leader of global order, expecting other nations to follow its vision. But India's bold assertion as the representative of developing nations has disrupted that framework entirely. By speaking on behalf of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that often feel marginalized by Western policies, India has elevated itself from being a regional player to a true global leader. This rise was not subtle or accidental, it was deliberate, rooted in India's long-standing policy of standing with the oppressed and underrepresented, and now amplified by its economic growth and diplomatic reach. Washington suddenly found that when global issues like climate change, trade inequality, and energy security were discussed, India's voice carried far more weight than before, and that undermined America's traditional monopoly on shaping outcomes. What particularly shocked the US was India's unapologetic defense of the interests of developing nations, even when it clashed directly with Western expectations. Whether it was pushing back against unfair climate targets, advocating for equitable vaccine distribution during the pandemic, or calling out the hypocrisy of sanctions that hurt poorer nations more than wealthy ones, India made itself the spokesperson for billions who felt sidelined. In doing so, it not only gained trust across the global South, but also positioned itself as a challenger to the West's moral authority. For Washington, used to dictating terms through its alliances and institutions, the idea of India galvanizing other nations into a unified voice was deeply unsettling. India's role in platforms like BRICS, the G20, and the SKO only magnified this shock. Instead of being seen as an appendage to Western-led institutions, India became a bridge between the developed and developing worlds, forcing global powers to acknowledge that solutions could not be dictated from Washington or Brussels alone. The US suddenly faced a competitor not in military terms, but in narrative building and legitimacy. India's leadership proved that influence in the 21st century was not only about power projection, but about representation and trust. This shift was profound because it highlighted a new reality. The global South no longer needed a Western savior. With India stepping forward, these nations found a leader that understood their struggles and shared their aspirations. For America, the shock lay in realizing that it could no longer assume its voice was the loudest or most credible in the room. India had redefined the game by aligning itself with billions of people often ignored in global decision-making, and in doing so it established itself as a new center of power that Washington could not afford to overlook. India has just proven that it is not a passenger in the journey of global politics, but a driver charting its own course. By asserting strategic autonomy, diversifying its defense and trade, defying pressure over energy, challenging dollar supremacy, balancing rival powers, and stepping up as the voice of the global South, India has shaken the very foundation of America's long-held dominance. This was not a rebellion. It was a revelation, a declaration that India's time as a power center is no longer a distant dream, but a present reality. The United States now stands face to face with a partner it cannot dictate to, a rival it cannot ignore, and a power it must respect. The shock is real, the message is clear, and the world will never look at India the same way again.